Good evening, my name is Dean Dodson. I'm Director of Policy Exchange. It's my pleasure to be your host tonight for this most important book launch. I've long admired the work of Steven Greer, first in Northern Ireland on the Troubles, not always in agreement, but he's continued his remarkable record of achievement, and the latest of which is Tackling Terrorism in Britain, Threats, Responses and Challenges 20 years after 9/11. We've got a star-studded panel tonight of become key authorities on the subject from a variety of perspectives to take you through their view of this most welcome book. Been relatively few things written about prevent policy, and such as there's been between hardcovers have been mostly hostile, and that's why this is so interesting a rectification of that imbalance. Also of particular significance, and why we're especially pleased to be able to help launch Professor Greer's book, is that he was recently following an inquiry. He was suspended from his role as professor there at the University of Bristol from teaching because of a complaint from the University of Bristol's Islamic Society. Inquiry, Professor Greer was unreservedly exonerated by that inquiry with respect, and I quote here from the official statement here, to charges of Islamophobia relating to his teaching and other public output, a verdict that was unanimously upheld upon appeal this last October 2021. And Professor Greer will, I think, be able to make one or two references to that, and much of the teaching which he did, which caused this controversy and led to the temporary suspension, was related to similar materials that are to be found in this most welcome book, which we're happy to commend today. And I know that others will have further questions, but the free speech dimensions, as well as the intrinsic merits of the debate about the contest counter-terrorism strategy and the prevent section of it, particularly presently the subject, of course, of an independent review by William Shawcross, previously chair of the Charity Commission, makes this intervention by Professor Greer most timely. And I know that you'll have many questions, usual House rules, no question too outrageous. You just have to state your name and organisation first. So if those of you who are not here could please stick up your electronic hands, that would be most welcome. So Professor Greer, over to you, and then we'll revert to the other panelists for their thoughts and opinions on your work.
Thank you very much, Dean. I'd like to begin by thanking Policy Exchange for the very generous opportunity to launch my book here this evening in the company of such an august panel and before what is likely to be a very well-informed audience. But before I proceed, I just want to make one slight correction to what you've said about the complaint. I wasn't never, in fact, suspended by the university. I continued to work as normal throughout the investigation. But the topic on the unit that I taught has been dropped, has been removed from the syllabus, and I'm on sick leave at the moment and expect to return to full-time study leave when I resume normal work. So in the brief time at my disposal here, I propose to focus upon three core observations from the book. First, there is no solution to terrorism in contemporary Britain in the sense of a policy package waiting to be discovered which delivers risk-free security. Second, there's no viable alternative to the current official counter-terrorist framework contest with its four work streams: prepare, protect, prevent and pursue. Third, the most vital element in effectively tackling domestic terrorism lies in the cultivation of an active state-society partnership. Let me deal with each of these in turn. First, the reason there's no national solution to domestic terrorism concerns the character of the threat itself. Although the risk stemming from dissident armed Irish republicanism and the violent far right cannot be ignored, there can be no doubt that the principal threat, by a very wide margin, is presented by jihadis. Since 9/11, 116 people have been killed in acts of terrorism in the UK. 108 of these were murdered in Britain, 96% at the hands of jihadis who were also responsible for almost 100% of the 1,000 or so total casualties. Jihadi terrorism is Islamist by nature, not just, as some maintain, as a result of Islamophobic social and official attribution. This is clear from many sources, not least the testimonies of those involved. Jihadi terrorism in Britain and the world over seeks to establish, including by acts of indiscriminate mass murder, a global Islamic caliphate governed by a particularly brutal interpretation of Islamic law. This version of Islam is, of course, rejected by the vast majority of Muslims in this country and the wider world, but it has three particularly important implications for domestic counter-terrorism. First, jihadis operating in Britain are not motivated primarily, or even at all, by a sense of national disadvantage or discrimination, however real this may be for many Muslims. Addressing these problems, though a worthy goal in itself, is therefore unlikely to solve the problem of domestic jihadi terrorism. The principal grievance, as the jihadis themselves repeatedly stated, concerns what they erroneously see as the UK's anti-Muslim foreign policy. This is at best a mistake, because there is no one-size-fits-all approach by the UK to Muslim majority states, much less one characterised by Islamophobia. In fact, the UK has very diverse relations with Muslim countries around the world. For example, those with Syria, Iran, and Afghanistan are problematic, to say the least. But Turkey and Saudi Arabia are allied with the UK in different ways. The myth of the UK's Islamophobic foreign policy is driven by powerful external forces. It's not, therefore, easy to counter, but it must nevertheless be constantly challenged. The second implication of domestic jihadi terrorism is that there is no obvious national political solution to it, akin to the Belfast or Good Friday Agreement of 1998. And even if there were, there's no credible domestic political movement with whom negotiations could be conducted in order to deliver it. Thirdly, Muslim communities in Britain offer potentially the most powerful social resource with which to tackle jihadi terrorism. This is not because they are in any sense to blame for it. It is rather because Muslims are far better placed than anyone else to challenge the distortion and debasement of their faith, which lie at the heart of Islamist terrorism. So moving on from my first point, the no solution issue, the second of the three core observations I want to extract from my book is there is no alternative to contest. However, two types of critique can be distinguished, rejectionism and reformism. Rejectionism is simply untenable because no one has yet made an adequately articulated argument that contest should be abandoned in its entirety. And there is, in any case, no sign of a comprehensive alternative. Instead, the Prevent programme is the only element which some suggest should be scrapped because it is allegedly based upon Islamophobia, racism, and the systematic violation of human rights. It has also been maintained that other toxic effects, including the chilling of academic and public debate, have occurred as a result. But for several reasons, these claims rest on very shaky ground. First, it is yet to be explained how Prevent can be inherently Islamophobic and racist when it is based on models developed by several Muslim countries. It's also very difficult to see how it can be systematically in violation of human rights when a referral is no more objectionable than a complaint to the police made about a noisy late-night party, and when a refusal to cooperate with it carries no penalty. Finally, it is unclear how Prevent can have the toxic effects alleged when recent scientific polling shows that very few people have even heard of it. Furthermore, when it is explained to them, the overwhelming majority, including Muslims, immediately appreciate the justifications for the program. Two types of reformist critique of contest can be distinguished. One, liberalisation, advocates improving accountability, transparency, etc., while the other, securitisation, involves strengthening its punitive elements. The debate between these two alternatives is where the quest for appropriate public policy lies. And choosing between them brings me to the final observation from my book, the need to cultivate an active state-society partnership. The primary responsibility of the state in tackling domestic terrorism is to build public resilience on the clear understanding that there is no perfect security solution. And it must do so by managing a double risk. On the one hand, the most effective means must be found to tackle terrorism itself. But in choosing between and implementing these, it is also vital to ensure their legitimacy in terms of democracy, human rights, the rule of law, and the maintenance of liberal cosmopolitanism. For its part, society should adhere to the following obligations. First, there must be no equivocation about the utter unacceptability of each and every kind of terrorism. Second, the debate about how to respond to it should not be constructed in terms of the kind of crude antagonisms favoured by some. These include, for example, the state versus the Muslims and security versus liberty, where the latter is always assumed to be on the losing side. Third, the broad contours of contest in all four Ps should be universally accepted unless and until a comprehensive alternative can be specified. Finally, this should involve active constructive engagement with the details, but this must be grounded in reliable information and scientifically valid data rather than upon denunciation derived from dogma and prejudice. Let me finish with an example relating to Prevent. As I've said, the case for scrapping Prevent rests at best upon misunderstanding concerning its true character and about how it operates in practice. But there is nevertheless a valid debate to be had about how it might be liberalised or securitized. In my view, liberalisation, by, for example, improving transparency, would not only be welcome in its own right, it would strengthen the programme. In particular, further light needs to be shed upon the fact that in 2019-2020, 51% of referrals were for those with a mixed, unclear or unstable ideology. The remainder split almost equally between Islamist and far-right concerns. I would also add that, in my view, it would be counterproductive to securitize Prevent by making refusal to cooperate with it an offence, as some have suggested. For one thing, this would play into the hands of the rejectionists, and for another, de-radicalisation is only likely to be effective when it's voluntary, or when it is an effectively binding condition of post-custodial release on licence. I'd like to close now by thanking you for your attention, and I look forward to hearing your views about how terrorism in Britain should be tackled. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that presentation. It's even really valuable. If I could now turn to Sir Mark Rowley, last position in the Met, of course, as Assistant Commissioner for Specialist Operations and the Senior Counter-Terrorism lead in the country. Mark, always welcome on our platform, and we remember with pleasure your Colin Cranthorne Memorial Lecture in 2018.
Dean, thank you very much. Professor, a sort of really interesting book. I had a copy a couple of days ago, and I can't claim to have read every word, and I wouldn't like to sit a viva on it with you, but it's a great canter through the issues, and I look forward to looking at it in more detail. I think what was interesting about it for me, it addresses, I think, helps us provide some challenge to our core problem, which I would frame as follows. We have a powerful counter-terrorism machine that does a very good job stopping terrorist attacks it strives perfection. It will never get there. It's constantly trying to improve. We put in a whole load of learning and recommendations after the 2017 attacks, and I'm sure, for example, Sir John Saunders, who's doing the Manchester Inquest at the moment, may find other lessons. But we seem to be facing a pipeline that is producing ever more terrorists. As you say, the majority Islamist terrorists, but there are other variations in there as well in smaller numbers. Building a machine to deal with ever greater numbers of terrorists clearly isn't a solution, it's a mitigation. The solution, and where you spend a decent chunk of the book later on, which I think is very powerful, has to be about turning off the tap at the start of that pipeline. And so the sort of challenged prevent strategy. I think it's great to have such a sort of canter across the issues that looks back at the history of the ideology and puts the ideology at the centre of this rather than pretending otherwise. I think that's interesting. I think sort of looking at the ideology going back to the days post-Rushdie and what followed then I thought was fascinating. And I think drawing sort of the true facts about disadvantage and discrimination, sort of where there is and where there isn't, that isn't seen between communities. I think it's a good basis for getting through to the key arguments on the 4 Ps. But then you say you focus on prevent. I strongly agree with your hypothesis about this isn't just about the security apparatus. It's a wider community issue. In fact, the lecture that Dean references that I gave, my reflection on leaving that world 3 or 4 years ago, was exactly on that point. The need for a whole society approach was the label I used, and you've picked up something similar. I think the point you make about why this shouldn't be so contentious, identifying someone who may be vulnerable, particularly when the schemes that follow aren't mandatory, I think is important. And the safeguarding points is definitely one that I've made myself. I do think that sort of we need to have a clearer narrative around what prevent is and isn't, and that's your key recommendation. I think I've been asked in public many times about the sort of, in inverted commas, contentious nature of the prevent strategy, and I've always started, and this is with some groups who've had some very challenging individuals in them, says, okay, so let's rip up contest and start again. Is there anybody in the room who doesn't want a strand in this new strategy we're going to write today that is about preventing people being drawn into radicalisation and violent extremism? And I've never ever has anyone put their hand up and said, yeah, I would argue against that. I mean, sort of it's a bit like asking people to argue against world peace, isn't it? But it sort of illustrates the point. And therefore, we need a preventative strand in our strategy, and you identify its strengths and weaknesses. I strongly agree that I think because it comes out of the security architecture, it is not surprising that communities may be more suspicious about it. And I agree that it has been not as well communicated, hasn't been made as transparent as it might be, and that adds to that risk of suspicion and concern. And I think that is brought out really, really powerful. The parallel that I would use is, why is it different when, say, we expect a teacher who spots a 15-year-old who appears to be being groomed for sexual purposes. We expect a teacher to spot that, worry about it, bring in other appropriate authorities, social services, police, whoever it might be, and work to find a solution that involves probably a caring solution for the individual who's been groomed, provided by sort of caring and supportive agencies, and an enforcement solution, security forces, in this case police, to try and grab hold of the wicked individual who's trying to achieve that. Much of the prevent work is comparable to that, and yet isn't seen to be as obviously the right thing to do as that is. And I think that's so what we need to get across, recognising that countering radicalisation is a particularly hard thing to do. The fundamental, though, that I take from your book, which I think is really powerful, I hope lots of people read it, is the destruction of the anti-prevent narrative as largely filled by rumour, gossip, and mischief. Not to say that you come across, you conclude that it's perfect prevent, because it certainly isn't, but that destruction of that narrative and that demand for greater clarity, which I agree with, because I come back to the point I started with, we need a whole society approach because we have to turn down the tap. A bigger and bigger budget for my old world in policing and MI5 to deal with more and more terrorists is currently what is happening. Actually, success in the future is the tap being turned down and those apparatuses being able to scale down because there's less threat to deal with. Thank you.
Yep.
Brilliant. Thank you. If I could now call on Khalid Mahmood, MP for Birmingham Perry Barr, long-time observer and participant in the debates on these issues. Khalid, glad to have you as our senior fellow here, and you've been a pillar of non-sectarian politics in Birmingham through the years, so looking forward to hearing what you have to say.
Thank you, Dean, and thank you, Stephen and Dean, for supplying me the copy a day or so earlier. As Marcus said, I've gone through quite a bit of it, but I think it's something that such a detail that you put in the whole of the book, it will certainly need another going through quite intently. One point on theology that you put in, I think the description of the Khalifas, I think perhaps I'd like to have a chat with you afterwards at some stage and see how that is. Obviously, the huge historic perspective that you put in terms of Islam is fairly correct. And I think sometimes it looks at that. But I think more importantly, what we need to do is to look at the perspective of the challenges which you've done in terms of the Salafi issues and in terms of relation to the Muslim Brotherhood and the way that those actors have been working quite significantly. My first point goes back again to what everybody's talking about at the moment, is prevent. And I think it's really important that we start to really come to bottom this out. On a number of occasions, I've asked people who oppose prevent to come forward and work with me, to give me a way forward, to see what we can do to make this more acceptable to everybody. On all occasions, nobody has really come forward to look at this. And Mark's point here, first one, quite rightly, is that when we have allowed teachers, allowed staff, education staff to be able to look at people under their supervision to see if they have issues in relation to health, in relation to grooming, and all those sort of issues. This is just another arm of that, to be able to see. And in a sense, what we have to look at is the safety of the child more importantly than anybody else. And if that's what it does, then there should be no real opposition to that. And by saying that there were some teething problems when we started these issues, but by and large, if you look at it now, you hardly ever get a complaint. When you get a complaint, it's usually not directed to the real issues in relation to the particular case, perhaps in some instances, misunderstanding of what the issues were raised originally were. So we need to seriously look at that. I think one of the key things that we've got to do in terms of prevent is to open it up much more. I think the issue we've had in liaising with smaller organizations in terms of trying to work through community with that, I don't think that's quite worked. I think as a service have found out, if we let that out across to the people on a far wider scale, certainly within the Muslim community, but also in the indigenous community, to see what it is that we're trying to do, how we need their support to come on board to actually deliver this, I think we'll find far greater support than resistance. Of course, there are groups of people who are very tech savvy, who are able to get together very quickly on social media groups, who are therefore very easily able to huge sort of flood of tweets and emails and those sort of things, that they're very well apted in order to do that. So I think we've got to seriously look at that. We've also, in terms of de-radicalization across the UK, what we're going to look at is that I think we are in a far worse position now in terms of de-radicalization than we have ever been. I think there's a huge amount of people that are working on this. And although it's a small group, but they are working more or less unchallenged in the way that they're doing this. And also, one of the key things they have is isolation of young people from mainstream media and news. That is the first way that they tackle this. And I think what we've got to do is look at how we provide more active information to those young people, and we are able to move that forward. I think that really has to be a strategy for us to be able to deal with. And I think, you know, going forward through, one of the key things that you raise in terms of the hadith that you put in there, and following on from the Salafis and Abdul Wahhab's sort of teachings and those sort of things. Even in Saudi Arabia now, what they're going towards in terms of jurisprudence is directly from the Quran. They are starting to move away from some of the teachings from the hadith, which was by people who obviously had wanted to give jurisprudence to the issues and those that recorded some of the stories of the Prophet, peace be upon him. They did that. But I think it's far better to get jurisprudence directly, and a lot of people are moving towards this now. And so what we've got to do is challenge some of these people who are coming with these sort of hadiths in some instances to try and point young people. The big problem we have at the moment is the huge issue of understanding the religion, particularly predominantly people from South Asia who do not. And so therefore, in order to radicalize some of those people, it's not very difficult because you speak in Arabic, you speak in quoting of different verses of the Quran and things, and that happens. So I think it's a long story, but I think you made a very good attempt, and certainly I would like to go back to it. Perhaps we can have another discussion. So thank you for coming here with all those points, and we certainly look forward to moving forward. I believe my time's almost up, so I better quieten down before Dean calls me to order.
Thank you very much for your contribution, Khalid. And I think of great interest to note that through the years, from the time of the last Labour government, the coalition, and now Conservative governments, you've been a very strong voice in favour of Prevent. And I think as the electoral results have shown, as you've pointed out on several occasions, it hasn't done you much harm in Birmingham, Barr so far. So I think you know, it's that point which is certainly worth noting in the light of the issues around the public acceptance of Prevent across the country and in important cities such as Birmingham. Nimco Ali having difficulties coming in on her IT, so if I can just ask Alex Carlile, Lord Carlile of Berriew QC, former independent reviewer of terrorism legislation, of Prevent briefly himself, and then in a whole series of other interventions on national security debates. Always welcome on our platform, Alex, and look forward to hearing what you have to say.
Thank you, Dean. In 2017, 18, 19, I became worried about the quality of academic work that was being done on Prevent. And at a point in late 2019, I arranged for a very full review to be carried out by independent researchers into the academic product on Prevent. It became clear, and the estimate I was given by the experts was that approximately 25% of the academic articles written on Prevent were written with a true academic aim of being objective, analysing the evidence, producing quality research and empirical conclusions. Follows from what I've just said that I was advised that 75% of the academic product was of no or very little value. It's therefore a particular pleasure to be able to have read, albeit at breakneck speed, the manuscript of Professor Greer's book. I think that it is extremely strong in its academic credentials. The footnotes refer to multiple sources of considerable quality and evidential integrity. It's also very readable which, you'll forgive me, Professor Greer, doesn't always happen with books written by academics on subjects that have at least some legal context. And I absolutely support the broad conclusions you've reached. The question of the threat is sometimes argued in rather emotional terms. I hear myself being told that I'm exaggerating the level of jihadist, Islamist violent threat of terrorism because right-wing extremism is now growing at such pace. It is certainly correct that right-wing extremism has grown. The statistics of Prevent show that to be the case. References to Prevent of people who are thought to have right-wing extremist ideation are quite high, approaching 50%. However, if you look at the danger represented by violent Islamism on the one hand and right-wing extremism on the other, it is a truism and evidentially supported that whereas there are a few right-wing extremists who present very serious danger, if you create a danger matrix of 0 to 10, Islamist extremism reaches at least the level 7 on that matrix, and right-wing extremism 3. And therefore, we must not use right-wing extremism as an excuse for seeming to let down our guard on Islamist violent extremism. What is Prevent? Well, I was in a meeting about a year and a half ago with some Prevent project operators, and they were all middle-aged Muslim men. And I started the conversation by saying to them, Prevent is toxic. And they looked at me with surprise and said, what do you mean? And I said, well, if you disagree with the proposition that Prevent is toxic, you tell me what Prevent is. And one of them said, well, it is what it says on the tin. It is preventing people, particularly young men, from becoming terrorists. And when the community in which, said the man, I and my colleague here live, when they say to us, what is this Prevent thing that you're doing? We tell them that. We're preventing people like your son and your husband and your brother from becoming influenced into becoming terrorists. And when I asked them whether that explanation worked, they looked at me as though I was an extremely foolish person because they said, oh, 99.9% recurring of our community absolutely support what we're doing. When I asked them, what about the false positives? Well, the answer to that question is, so how many people do the police arrest who are never charged with a criminal offense at all? They can be arrested, they can be questioned, but they're not charged, let alone go to court. And when you're talking about something which is as early in someone's journey towards extremism as Prevent and the Channel Project, there are bound to be false positives, so they're to be avoided wherever possible. And I think that Professor Greer's book puts Prevent into a much more realistic context than much of the academic writing that we have had in the past. He and I share an unlikely distinction, which is to have been the victims, both of us, of people trying to reject the work we are doing because they don't like the conclusions that they think we're going to reach. I was litigated out of being the Prevent reviewer, so I'm delighted that William Shawcross is doing it now, and I'm sure he'll produce a very good report. 3 points before I finish my comments. One, I'm not against no change. I think there should be change in Prevent. I think it could be even more effective than it is. I think that we should look at the way in which similar projects are run abroad. I looked at projects in Denmark and Germany in particular. I don't think they were better than ours, but they were different, and we have things to learn. Also, we need to look at the organization of Prevent. Prevent coordinators at the moment are based in local authorities. I don't think that works. I think Prevent coordinators should be a collegiate body, much more like, say, health and safety inspectors, working in a semi-independent organisation funded by the Home Office, but not being run on a day-to-day basis by the Home Office. And the third comment I would make is about the use of the British values agenda. I'm absolutely in favour of British values being discussed in the context of Prevent and in the context of countering terrorism generally. But I think so far government has taken a naive approach to this issue. If you go to where I was born, through Avon in North Wales, or if you go to East Anglia, to Swaffham in East Anglia, to pick a place out of the hat, you will find people are absolutely adhering to British values, but when they come to explain their British values, they're completely different. And I think we therefore need to switch from a British values description with those values described in detail to an understanding of proportionality between rights and duties, and the way in which, yes, you have a right of free speech and expression, but you also have a duty to ensure that in exercising that right, you do not undermine the polity of the society in which we live.
Thank you very much, Lord Carlile. I see first question coming up from Lord Campbell of Pittenweem. Lord Campbell, can you hear us?
Can you hear me?
We hear you loud and clear. I hope, Barr.
Thank
Who
you
is
very
your...
much. I feel I'm cheating slightly, since Alex Carlile and I presently share an office, as we have done throughout the major part of our joint political careers. And I promised to buy my own copy of the book and not to borrow his. But I was really interested by the opening principle which was discussed, namely to accept that there can be no defeat of terrorism. And while I accept the logic of that, it seems to me that that's a huge swallow for any government. And for governments, the easy response is to say we're going to add another few million to the budgets of the intelligence services. We're going to get them to employ more people. We're going to get them to employ people from a greater variety in the community. But I think I would accept that it's necessary to swallow that there may be no defeat. But I think it'd be a pretty big thing for governments to do so publicly.
Would Professor Greer care to answer first, and then we'll go to our other panelists?
Yes. By no solution, I mean no domestic solution to terrorism in Britain. But that doesn't mean there isn't a possibility of a global solution at some point in the future, but that's not imminent. But certainly this government and previous governments have quite readily embraced the idea of resilience. And in the supportive literature around the guides of various kinds with respect to the various limbs of the contest strategy, it's widely acknowledged that there can be no risk-free security solution to it. It's about building public resilience, educating the public into not being too discouraged every time there is a terrorist incident and thinking that there's been some significant security failure. There may well have been, and the debate about the Manchester Arena attack, of course, suggests that there were quite a few difficulties there. But because somebody gets through the security, for example, doesn't necessarily mean that there's been a massive security failure. Somebody should pay for it. Somebody's to blame for it. It just means that we can never be 100% safe in a free society.
Thank you. Sir Mark Rowley.
Yeah, I think it's a good point to draw out for further conversation. I suppose there's two different types of terrorism, aren't there? I suppose there's a spectrum, but some terrorists have a political objective which can be negotiated with, compromised with, And indeed, there are parts of the world where we look back at history and see people who were described as terrorists, and now we describe them as freedom fighters. In the context of the sort of the core part of this conversation, the sort of Islamist terrorists, that doesn't exist, does it? Because they have a supremacist, sort of pretty nihilistic view that is so inconsistent with any democratic principles that there is no compromise, there is no negotiation. So it's of a style of terrorism where that rules that approach out completely. Defeat, I'm not sure what defeat means. I certainly think a more powerful, sharper, more determined preventative strand, you could start to turn the tap down in a way that the problem starts to reduce. And that's based purely on domestic effort. I think that would be very hard, but I think we must aim for that, and I believe it is possible, but very difficult. I do think the global ideological challenge, that global context, as the book makes very clear, we are suffering a local dimension of a global issue. And so the global ideological challenge, which the Muslim world is tackling to varying extents. Some parts of the Muslim world very robustly countering this, other jurisdictions aggravating it, frankly. So that challenge across the world is the theatre that our local problems sit in, and we have to be prepared to see it in that context and use foreign policy and other global levers to try to impact upon this in a way, frankly, I think all governments have avoided doing. Most of the Western effort internationally has been a counter-terrorism sort of militaristic intervention effort where necessary, rather than a collaborative, global, preventative, counter-ideological solution.
Thank you. Khalid Mahmood MP. Sorry, you're muted. Can't hear you.
Sorry, I think by and large what has been said is something that I totally agree with. I think the one issue that we have really got to be careful about is the presence of significant leadership of the Muslim Brotherhood in the UK, which is here, which is working with lots of people. We see that through a number of organizations that are now built up and the way that they're pursuing this. And that's why I said that there is a growing element of radicalization now than there was earlier. And I think we really have to look at how we get there. And I think Stephen's quite right that this issue has got to be addressed by the Muslim community itself. We've got to get people from within the community to stand up. And that's why I think there has to be a broader issue of engaging through Prevent and through the programs with the wider Muslim community as well.
Thank you. Lord Carlile, QC.
If somebody had said to me, say in 1975, do you think the Soviet Union will be defeated? I would have said extremely unlikely. And if somebody had said to me, do you think the Soviet Union will run out of steam on its own? I would have said, that's just crazy. And it happened. So, you know, like Lord Campbell, I think there may be a possibility of this kind of terrorism coming to an end, this kind of radicalism coming to an end, though it will probably, if that happens, it will happen just as the end of the Soviet Union did in its own region through local influences. However, it's not going to happen in a hurry. It's going to last probably another couple of decades, and at least one more generation will have to deal with it. We have different ways of dealing with it now. If you look at the politics of the Gulf, for example, the way in which responsible Gulf countries are dealing with the Taliban in Afghanistan is to a great extent predicated on the clear knowledge that a Taliban-led Afghanistan, not because they want it, but because they're too chaotic to stop it, will lead to an increase in international terrorism. But those states are going to do what they can to stop that from happening. So we have, I think, a more international, respectable world. But I think we have to work on the basis, unfortunately, that the level of threat that we have now is going to continue or get worse, and that there will continue to be radicalization of quite a large number, perhaps a diminishing number now, of young people from Western countries who will go and give it succor and breath.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I see a question now from Dr. Rumi Hassan, University of Sussex.
Yes, thanks all for very interesting comments. I haven't read your book, Professor Greer, which I'm looking forward to doing, but I wanted to just flag up a very interesting and relevant debate in France of the last 2 decades or so. And remember, France has had even more terrorist attacks than we have had. And it's a debate between Olivier Roy and Gilles Kepel. And it actually relates to the arguments, if you like, for and against Prevent. In a nutshell, Roy is arguing that Islamism and Islamic terrorism are a manifestation of the alienation of Muslim youth. Whereas Keppel says, no, we must understand the specificities, that it's the ideology of Islamism and jihadism, which is really the motivating factor. I actually come down on the side of Keppel on this, but I've in my work tried to understand the roots, if you like, that lead to the ultimate, say, jihadist behavior. And what I would like to ask the panel is the importance of highly segregated communities nurturing a very strong Muslim identity, which in turn can lead to certain vulnerabilities that lead some to radicalization and at the extreme to jihadist behavior, acts of terrorism. So from my point of view, the starting point, and it's a generational struggle, is to, if you like, desegregate communities and reduce a very powerful Islamic identity so that the appeal of the ideology, which is Keppel's argument, is then minimized. It might not root out terrorism altogether, but therefore the path, the link that takes one to a strong identity, to terrorism, that link is broken. And therefore, again, I said, generational task is to desegregate communities and integrate people into mainstream society. Thank you. That's one point. Professor
Greer.
Yeah, I think there's a lot in that contribution, and I'm very grateful for it. One of the analyses that I've relied upon quite heavily is Leichen's book, Europe's Angry Muslims. And one of the thesis in that is that there's a double alienation going on with Muslim youth in Europe, and Britain included. And that is, in the British context, an alienation from what he calls the folk Islam of their parents, from Pakistan and Bangladesh, and alienation from liberal materialist Western society. And the jihadis offer a way out of that. They offer a resolution of it, which is to say that you don't have to follow your parents' folk Islam, which requires you to marry your cousin from the village in Pakistan or whatever it might be. It's a more portable Islam, a more kind of austere Islam that's not so connected to the culture of any particular locality. And that, for many people, of course, young people are often unsure of themselves, their identity, and their way forward in the world. And they are often attracted by instant and dramatic solutions to the world's problems. And that's part of the issue as well. But I do think there's a huge challenge in cosmopolitan societies in managing integration on the one hand, encouraging people from all backgrounds to mix properly and appropriately learn the indigenous language, English in our case, and at the same time permitting them and protecting them to preserve their own culture. The balance between those two things is a very difficult one to strike. But I think I agree very much with what the late Joe Cox said. You know, we ought to emphasise the things that we share first before we go on to discuss the things over which we differ.
Thank you. Anyone else want to come in now? Sir Mark Rowley.
Just a quick point on that. So from practical experience more than academic, I think agree with some of the sort of thesis that radicalisation plays on those who have a grievance. There is almost always there's some sort of anger and grievance that's part of the vulnerability, which gives the radicaliser, whether that's a person or material, something to hook into. But that doesn't mean that grievance creates terrorism. And I think it's just one of the factors within it. The point I wanted to focus on more, though, I think Dame Louise Casey's work sort of 3 or 4 years ago, a review of integration and opportunity, was a very powerful piece of work with some very powerful evidence about how a lack of integration for some communities in Britain, and that's not putting blame on the community, it's just a fact of history, the way some communities have settled. That lack of integration is in some cases linked to a whole range of social ills, whether it's poverty, education attainment, opportunities for women in the workplace, etc., etc. And one of those social ills is, in some cases, a vulnerability to extremism because of the isolation and sort of lack of connection to sort of mainstream sort of values and behaviours. So I do think there's something in that sort of social policy which links into this area, and I think Louise's report nailed it really clearly.
Brilliant. Thank you. Khalid Mahmood MP.
Thank you. Yeah, I mean, I think Mark and I are reading off the same hymn sheet by and large. I was going to say the issue around Dame Louise Casey's report, which in some quarters was quite attacked, quite hard. And I think for being quite reasonable and quite honest in what you try to raise. When you have communities, as we have in inner city areas, whether it's Manchester, Bradford, Birmingham, or whatever, we have huge amount of segregation. We have single community by and large in those areas. Children go to over 90% of Muslim communities, schools which are run by the local authority, not which are Islamic schools. And so they basically are just in there. The problem we have is the origins of those communities, where those communities are from a rural background, where they've not had the education. And this is down to second generation, and some instances, third generation of people who are living here, who've not had the right education themselves, who are not in tune with the education system, who don't necessarily always go to school to see how their children are progressing. And we have high rates of people being in custody and therefore interned into prison within predominantly the Muslim and the Pakistani community, Bengali community as well. Low levels of education achievement in those areas. And I think what happens is, by and large, the people who prey on them is not necessarily just the use of the foreign policy scenarios, but also the lack of understanding of the educational achievement and be able to understand the people who are using that. And I think that is the real problem that we have to get into. In most of these areas, in Birmingham, Lozells, for instance, a part of the constituency that I represent, I was working with the Labour Party up in Tamworth, which is a sort of a rural, semi-rural working class town. And somebody opened the door with his Aston Villa kit on, because Aston Villa were playing that morning. He was going to watch it on the TV. And I said, "Oh, why are you supporting Villa then?" He said, "I used to live in Lozells." And he said, "I moved out because I couldn't, in that area, have any social, because people bought up those properties together. They have then become deprived in those areas because of the in some instances, lack of education, lack of support, and health support as well. And so therefore, the whole thing has become, in a particular way, which becomes easy picking for those that want to radicalize. So there's a big issue around all of that we have to do that. And education plays a huge role, particularly for the parents, but clearly for the children as well. Girls do much better, by the way, in terms of education than boys. It's the boys that we have a little problem with.
Thank you. Lord Carlile, QC. You're silent. Can't hear you, Alex.
I'm sorry. I agree with everything Khalid has just said. I'm dubious about social engineering. I think the government is not generally very well qualified to take these decisions. We're now onto a third generation of a large community of Muslims, or communities of Muslims in this country. I think they are the best people to decide what soft power should be used to give them greater advantage in society. I think there is a problem about leadership in some Muslim communities, Khalid, because I think it's quite difficult for the clever young people to become leaders. That's because right. They tend to defer too much to old men of my age. So I think we need to encourage better leadership in the Muslim communities. But I don't want to go the way of France. If you go look at what is happening in the banlieues of Paris, it's very ugly, very divided, and often very violent, much more so than in parts of Birmingham or London. So I'd be reluctant to go down that road.
Thank you.
Well, sorry,
can I just come? Because we've got limited time. Sir John Jenkins, former ambassador in Saudi Arabia. Sir John, are you still there? Not there, and disappeared from view. Sorry, Khalid, you were saying?
Yeah, just very quickly. I am not in favor of social engineering at all. Well, the point I was trying to make is, which is what you made, Alex, as well, is very clearly, I've got a huge issue with trying to get young councillors into the Labour Party, into the council, to become those new leaders, because we have a stagnant group of people who are not able to deliver that leadership. And the real important, I think, throughout all of this is there's got to be real good leadership from that. And I think some of the young women are starting to provide that. We need to get more support for them. But I think it's the males that we have a real problem with. And really we need to do that and get them to start to be more active. Thank
you. Just ask one final question of our panel. Several items, I think, of interest. One, you've described, Professor Greer, the grievance culture, the number of themes that arise regularly in Islamist discourse and that have resulted in the discrediting in the eyes of certain sectors of communities of the Prevent programme. One, do you think it has actually been discredited that much, or is this just a claim? Two, insofar as it has been discredited, whether government has done a successful enough pushback. I noticed that in the index that one of the bodies that's meant to be responsible for pushing back at various narratives, namely RICU, which has been located within the Home Office and other sections of government, that RICU is not referred to there in your text. And just was wondering, bearing in mind that this may appear in the forthcoming Prevent review, just your thoughts and that of panelists as to why the pushback of RICU in some instances has been rather minimalistic, in other words, only against ISIS and Al-Qaeda using violence rather than against wider grievance narratives. The other thing which I just wanted to reflect upon is that the number of referrals of the far right to channel, in contrast to the actual numbers of terrorism attacks conducted, as you say, the vast majority of which are still undertaken by jihadists as opposed to far right. So the reasons for this apparent disparity, again, this may be reflected in the forthcoming Prevent review. I'd be grateful for your thoughts of that of the panel as a final question.
Okay. Shall I go first?
Please, Professor, yes.
His hands up. Alex, maybe you'd like
yes,
to say
Professor Greer, if you go.
Oh, I'll go. Okay. Well, difficult questions. Is Prevent discredited? No, I don't think so. I mean, the strange thing about Prevent is that the voices of the those who want to scrap it are much louder than the voice of those who want to retain it or to build upon it. I agree very much with Khalid that the majority of Muslim, and this is borne out by the scientifically reputable studies, the randomly selected opinion studies, that the vast majority of Muslims and non-Muslims support Prevent. When they find out what it's about, most people, again, the opinion surveys clearly show, don't even know about Prevent. But when they hear about it, they appreciate it. So we do have a tiny but very vocal, very noisy minority for whom Prevent is discredited. On your second question, Dean, I think the government and the people who wanted to, defend and promote Prevent didn't do a very good job at the outset. They let the rejectionist critics have too much of a field day with the issue. Didn't defend it very effectively, in my view, and that's left. That means that has resulted in those of us like myself who want to support it playing catch up with it. About the far right, it is strange. I don't know if Sir Mark Rowley can throw some light on this. Why the numbers of far right referrals are more or less equal to that for the Islamist ones. Given that the threat levels are very much different, the jihadi threat level is much, much greater than the far right level. Well, whether this is to do with increased awareness on the part of people who report Prevent, or whether there's been some kind of attempt to increase the number of far right referrals to give a sense of a balance, I really don't know.
Thank you, Sir Mark.
So I've managed to find the quote I was looking for whilst looking at that. It does look odd, the balance in the Prevent referrals compared to the terrorism threat, doesn't it? It's good that the right, sort of far right extremism threat is on the agenda now, but it should be kept in proportion, as people have already said, with other threats. I just wonder whether there's a cultural hesitance in reporting Islamist extremism, which is greater than any hesitance reporting right-wing extremism. I was prompted, I was thinking about this a couple of months ago, and I had a sort of one of those moments, think, that's an interesting link. And I look back at Lord Laming's Victoria Climbay inquiry, which was published in 2003. She was a young girl, about I think 6 or 7, of African heritage, whose carer is, I think it was a mother and aunt, I may be wrong in that, had some very sort of odd and extreme beliefs, and she suffered awfully, people will recall, and despite many opportunities to spot this, social services, police and others completely failed. And there's a whole lot of systematic issues identified in the report, but in chapter 16, Lord Laming asks this cultural question. He says, several times during this inquiry, I find myself wondering whether a failure by a particular professional to take action to protect Victoria may have partly been due to that professional losing sight of the fact that her needs were the same as those of any other 7-year-old girl, regardless of their cultural background. And his concern then, the nervousness about interfering in cultures that I don't understand. Do I understand enough in the context we're talking about now to distinguish between the sort of 99.9% of Muslims and their beliefs with the fractional percent of extremists? And I think I worry that hesitance is part of that differential in number. And I think it's interesting, that quote from Lord Laming. I think it's relevant to how we look at this today. Very hard to evidence, but that's my instinct.
Khalid Mahmood, final verdict on that and the question. Sorry, you're silented.
I think Alex wanted to come on this. I'd much rather give him a bit of time.
Okay, we've got very little time. Lord Carlile. Yeah.
3 quick points. The first is that I'm very happy for Prevent challenge. It's survived the challenge. It's not been discredited, and it will continue. Second, your point about Riku, Dean, I think you've been a little unfair to Riku, if I may say so. Berriew is an operational organization, and for example, it's taken hundreds of thousands of radicalizing sites off the internet, which is really what its job is. It should have a higher public profile. And the third point I wanted to make is about the Channel Project and right-wing extremism. There is a problem with the Channel Project about how cases are referred to it, and particularly the way in which channel panels assess cases. I think that may be responsible for the numbers we're getting at the moment. And I'm hopeful that William Shawcross in his review will address that issue.
Thank you. It's been an outstanding panel. Thank you all for coming. As I say, I urge you all to have a look at Professor Greer's book. I'm sure it will cause much further comment. We're delighted to have played our part in starting that debate. Thank you. Good night. Over and out.
Thank you.
Thank you, Dean.